Welcome, Gunrunner.
I don't think I need to explain Sinclair's legacy in the home computer market, or their rapid rise to success. There are plenty of other great videos and websites that do just that. But I think we definitely need to set the scene and give some historical perspective to exactly where we are going with this story. So the year is 1983 and Sinclair Research Limited are riding high on the wave created by the ZX Spectrum, the very first colour home computer that could be purchased for under £100. They were also still selling plenty of its predecessor too, the Sinclair ZX81, as a much cheaper budget-priced entry into home computing. Everyone was wondering where Sinclair would go next, and there were lots of whisperings about all sorts of products that were being developed in their labs in Cambridge. But perhaps the most interesting one of all was a project codenamed the LC3. If you were wondering where that name came from, LC3 was a shortening of Low Cost Colour Computer 1983, which already tells you a lot of what you need to know about it. But the LC3 wasn't actually going to be a home micro. It was actually designed as a games console. Now that probably sounds surprising to anyone who's familiar with the history of Sinclair Research or who's watched the excellent movie The Micromen. I say this because Sir Clive Sinclair himself has been quoted as saying that he didn't like video games, and it's been said that he was really annoyed and frustrated about the Spectrum being used primarily to play them. But what this does tell us is that he really did give a free rein to his team of engineers to just create their own ideas and see what worked. And speaking of engineers, step forward one Martin Brennan. Now this name might seem familiar to many of you out there, but we'll come back to that in a moment. Martin joined Sinclair Research in 1982 specifically to investigate and develop new artificial intelligence algorithms, but he soon became wrapped up in a joint effort to get Sinclair's promised microdrives onto the market. He would eventually engineer the highly useful ZX Interface 1, through which the microdrives could connect to the Spectrum. But Martin very much had an idea of his own that he wanted to develop further, a really cheap home system that would appeal to customers due to its gaming capabilities, but also provide scope for expansion, so they could build it up into a full home computer in due course. Designed to be inexpensive and as low cost as possible, it would have replaced the monochrome ZX81 as Sinclair's budget-priced offering, and helped bolster the company in the wake of new machines that were just starting to arrive in the Far East. There was already a template for an expandable system such as this too, in the form of the Mattel Intellivision. Launched in America in 1979, the Intellivision had been developed as a games console to rival Atari's market-leading 2600 VCS. But unlike Atari's system, the Intellivision was created with the idea that the main console unit, or master component as it was called, could become a full-blown home computer with the addition of a keyboard, which would then add other expansion possibilities too. Sinclair's machine would do things slightly differently though. Rather than the add-ons providing extra hardware to help with this expansion, the LC3 would contain everything needed in one small box. This would make the whole system much cheaper overall, as well as offering a far lower cost and much simpler upgrade route. The design of the LC3 would be based around a Zilog Z80 CPU, much as the ZX80, ZX81 and ZX Spectrum had before it. Alongside this would be a new custom ULA that would provide the graphics and sound as well as other more minor functions. There would be a new operating system that would interface directly with a front-facing cartridge slot, much like the existing Sinclair microdrives. The reason for this being at the front was that the design made allowances for the LC3 keyboard to be placed on top, so it would look much more like a real computer when all put together. A basic interpreter would be available from day one that could be loaded via ROM cartridge. Standard mic and ear sockets would be provided to load and save from tape when the LC3 was in full-on computer mode. The LC3 was designed to be as efficient and cheap as possible, so it would only feature a very small amount of memory, Presumably this could be upgraded using some kind of expansion slot or via RAM chips added to ROM cartridges. And it also featured a very unique display mode too. The whole screen would be character based, much like a home computer, but each of those characters could be user defined. This would basically give the LC3 a bitmap display, but in a much cheaper and more efficient way, and also provide the text modes needed for home computer functionality. According to several ex-Sinclair engineers, the LC3 design was pretty much finalised, and several wire-wrapped prototypes have been built for testing purposes. However, it never went into the next phase, which would have involved producing prototypes of the final board and fabricating the case. Sadly, none of these prototypes or even any of the design documents for the LC3 have ever been discovered, despite it being so far into the testing phase. We don't have any final specs for the system either, so we aren't able to compare it to any other systems of the time. We only have the words of ex-Sinclair personnel to go on. In fact, Sir Clive Sinclair himself had some comments to make about the system when he was asked about it in a Sinclair user interview back in 1986. I still think the LC3 was the best approach for Sinclair. It was a complete colour computer, entirely on 2 chips, very much like the Japanese Nintendo machine, but many years beforehand. With those comments in mind, I'm sure you want to know what happened to the LC3 then, and discover why it was cancelled. Well, apparently it was still being heavily considered by management when the company's leaders met in November 1983 to ponder the firm's plans going into 1984 and beyond. As no serious Asian threats had yet emerged, and Spectrum production was getting cheaper all the time, a line was drawn through the LC3. Sinclair Research's managing director, Nigel Searle, was, according to several ex-Sinclair staff, very unwilling to risk the company's cash cow, the Spectrum. The LC3 was mooted to arrive at a sub-£50 price point, leaving much less room for profit than its older sibling. It is also thought that the price of ROM cartridges may have played a big part in this decision too. An attempt to sell such media for the Spectrum had been a woeful failure. Nobody wanted to pay £20 plus for a cartridge when they could buy a tape for just a few pounds. The only console thus far that has seen any success in the UK was the Atari 2600. This was mainly due to its early arrival on the market, many years before the ZX Spectrum and other home micros came into the scene, giving it a huge head start. But even then it was still very much seen as a rich person's toy in the early 1980s due to the high price of its games. So what of Martin Brennan then? I did say I would return to him in due course. Well, he continued to work at Sinclair right up until the takeover of Amstrad. In this time he worked on several other cutting-edge pieces of technology, such as the unreleased Sinclair Loki. Now there's a story for another video. But it was after leaving Sinclair that his name became more well known. This is because he had become one of the founding members of Flare Technology, where he was one of the chief designers on the much anticipated, but ultimately doomed, Konix multisystem. From here he would go on to engineer the last ever British designed games console in the hugely powerful but sadly unsuccessful Atari Jaguar. So you can actually follow a really interesting lineage of British designed consoles from the Sinclair LC3 to the Loki, onto the Flare with the Konix multisystem, and then Atari with the Jaguar and Jaguar 2, and finally the VM Labs Nuon, many of which were sadly never released, but it's clear to see his talent as an engineer. It's a great shame that Sinclair never pulled the trigger on the LC3, and in hindsight I very much think they made the wrong choice. There was definitely a niche to be carved for a low-cost home console in the UK, as both the Atari 2600 Junior and Sega Master System proved. If indeed Sinclair had released the LC3, I'm sure they would have had the backing of all the major games publishers in the UK, thanks to their existing relationships and those companies' familiarity with the Z80 CPU that was contained within it too. I also think that Sinclair's main reason for the system's cancellation was severely short-sighted, as while they would have made far less money on selling the hardware, they could have easily introduced a licensing model such as the ones used by other console manufacturers, and even made money back via software. I'm also pretty confident that had the LC3 been released, Sinclair wouldn't have succumbed to Alan Sugar's Amstrad, and might even still be around producing games and hardware. We can dream, eh? isn't the last word we will hear about a Sinclair badged console. As well as the often talked about Loki project, which is much more about offering a proper upgrade route to the ZX Spectrum than anything else, there were several pretenders to the crown over in Eastern Europe, most notably The Hobbit and the Elf TV game, which I've already covered in other videos, so if you're interested in finding out more, just click the links in the top right hand corner as they appear. Eventually, a Sinclair branded console would arrive in 2015 in the form of the Sinclair ZX Vega, which was designed and manufactured by Retros Computers Limited. Using an emulated form of the ZX Spectrum, this was a plug-and-play device containing built-in controls, SD card slot and 1000 games. The success of the Vega meant a quick follow-up was soon announced in the form of the ZX Vega Plus, a handheld version of the device. But that is a story that I really don't want to cover here, so you know what to do. It's a shame that Britain's biggest video games-based success story never produced a home console and still aren't around today to continue their legacy. But I hope that you enjoyed this story of what might have been, and I'll be back with another interesting tale very soon. If you enjoyed this video and want to see more just like it, then please consider visiting my Patreon and making a pledge. You'll even get access to a host of exclusive content there too. I've been the Retro Laird, I hope you've enjoyed watching, and I'll see you all again very soon.